Children and families are in crisis. More than ever, they're being exposed to violence, abuse and neglect. And the fallout is devastating. Welcome to Stories from Berry Street, a podcast that explores how one of Australia's largest independent children and family services organisations dedicates itself to keeping children, young people and families safe, thriving and hopeful. I'm your host, Richelle Hunt. Join me as I talk to some extraordinary people at Berry Street and discover the realities of working in child protection and family violence spaces, the incredible work that's being done to address the rising tide of harm and violence, and what we as a community can do to help.
Often we're really concerned about stranger danger and random people that might harm our children, but unfortunately, often the people are known to the children who perpetrate sexual abuse. We know that 1 in 3 children experience physical abuse, like broken bones, for example.
That's Allison Cox, Director of Take 2, Berry Street's specialist therapeutic service for children and young people. An occupational therapist by trade, Allison's been at Berry Street for about 9 years and has a long history of addressing the mental health impacts on children from the trauma of abuse, neglect and a whole range of adverse, life-altering experiences. The experiences these children have in their formative years have a profound impact on their development, and it takes relationships with safe, predictable carers and ongoing therapy to help them recover. Bodhi Priti is another specialist I'll be talking to. Bodhi is a clinical team leader at Take 2 and shines a light on the kinds of trauma children are experiencing and the incredible work being done to help kids heal and take their next best step forward. But let's start at the beginning with Allison and find out more about Take 2.
We are a service that works across the state of Victoria, so we've got offices in Mildura and in Bairnsdale and down in Warrnambool and everywhere in between. And we provide counselling services and support services to children who, for a whole range of reasons, are unable to live with their family anymore. And that's usually because they've experienced significant child abuse, neglect or family violence. And we work with those children and their carers and their birth families, if they're still having contact, towards helping the children understand what's happened and how they can be assisted to thrive and do all of the things that are important to them. And we fit within Berry Street, who provide a whole range of services, including providing homes for children, foster care services, family violence services, and also have that counselling lens to our services.
We talk about trauma a lot these days, but can you take us through what trauma looks like from a Berry Street perspective?
Yeah, it is a word that's now becoming really common, which is, a fantastic development that there is an increasing understanding now. And trauma is how an event impacts on you as a person. So that can range from experiencing, unfortunately, relatively everyday things like a car accident or natural disasters to being harmed by the people that are there to love you. And so for the children that we work with, it's the children that have been harmed by physical abuse, sexual abuse, where maybe they haven't had sufficient food to eat or warm clothes to wear. Maybe they've been left alone for very long periods by themselves before they were ready to be able to look after themselves. Or maybe were scapegoated within their family or kind of blamed for everything in their family.
And so if this level of trauma is happening to children, what impact does that have if a child is experiencing any of the traumatic events that you've just listed? How does that then go on to impact that child's life?
Yeah, so it has a devastating impact for children and into adulthood. We know that one of the really long-term impacts of mental health difficulties for children is it damages their sense of safety. The people that were there to love and care for them and provide them with safety weren't able to do that. And so that makes it really difficult for the children to trust in other adults that they meet. They might automatically assume that those adults will also harm them, and that will then play out in all of their relationships. It also has an impact on their opportunities to grow and learn because they'll be anticipating harm coming to them, which means that they'll often be in a fight or flight response all of the time.
How this plays out day to day for kids can be extremely disruptive in their personal lives and especially at school, as Allison explains.
So one of the harms that can happen for children is that they don't get to go to school. So there may be a level of disorganisation at home. That means that they miss out on lots of school opportunities, which means then that they have trouble learning how to read and write, for example. And then when they do go to school, because they haven't learnt how to read or write, or they've missed out on things in the classroom, they might then become disruptive in order to survive that environment, which then obviously has an impact on their opportunities for learning.
And then is there a higher rate of dropping out at an early age?
Yeah, so certainly we do see that it is much harder for children to finish school because, again, they've often missed out on big chunks of school, so there's real gaps in their learning, and it makes it a harder place for them to be at. Conversely, it can also be one of the safest places for them. If home is a tricky space, then school can be a sanctuary.
So looking at it from the home lens, another term that we use a lot now is intergenerational trauma. But can you actually talk us through what that means and how that occurs?
Yeah, so there's two aspects of that in particular. One is that the main way that we learn how to parent our children is by being parented ourselves. So we think back to how our mum or our dad did something, or our grandma, and that informs how we parent our own children. If we haven't had good positive role models, then we haven't learnt how to do that in the way that our children need. So we might repeat things that our parents did to us. So we may repeat hurting our children if that's the thing that we learnt. The other thing that happens for the children that we work with is they've often become really isolated from family. And so when they have their own children, they haven't got the village around them. And so there's, again, no one else around them to help them, to teach them, to guide them about how do you feed children, how do you look after children, what time should children go to bed.
I guess that's why Berry Street works so closely with a whole family approach, because you're not just trying to help and support the child, you're trying to help and support the family unit, however that may look. There may be a mum and a dad, just a mum, just a dad, a mum and a mum, whatever that family unit looks like. But the entire family will often need support.
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, as we've seen with talking about intergenerational trauma, there's often negative things are transmitted through generations rather than positive child-affirming activities. But in addition, to heal things that might have happened, both from the current generation or from previous generations, so that they don't get repeated.
One thing I've learnt from doing this podcast and working with Berry Street, which has actually been really confronting, is the idea that a baby in utero can experience trauma. So going through trauma even before you're born. What's happening there, and how does that manifest in the child?
It is really confronting to think about. We often idealise pregnancy as a time of beautiful, calm mums who eat weird foods. But we know that, again, the baby is so dependent on their mum during that stage, and they receive all of their nutrients from their mum, hopefully a cosy kind of environment in which they can grow. We know that substances are transmitted across the umbilical cord for all of the positive reasons, but that also means that sometimes illicit substances are also transmitted. So unfortunately, sometimes some of the babies that we work with have been born substance affected. So that's a really concrete example of how babies can be impacted. But in addition, if the mums are scared or afraid themselves, so maybe they're in a family violence situation, their heart rate goes up and the baby can feel that that heart rate has gone up. So what we know is that when any of us are scared, our heart rate gets elevated, particular hormones get released into our bloodstream that help us to fight or flight the particular experience that we're in, and that all gets transmitted to the baby. So then the baby is also experiencing an elevated heart rate. They're feeling their body might be flooded with hormones, and that will impact the ability for the brain to grow and develop in the ideal circumstances.
Taking just a broader lens for a moment, do you think the average person maybe listening to this podcast is surprised by just how prevalent trauma is in our community? Because it's quite often hidden.
Yeah, I was quite shocked recently. Last year, the Childhood Maltreatment Study released its findings, which showed that about 1 in 4 children in the Australian community experience sexual abuse.
1 in 4.
Which is extraordinary to think that that's happening. Often we're really concerned about stranger danger and random people that might harm our children, but unfortunately, often the people are known to the children who perpetrate sexual abuse. We know that 1 in 3 children experience physical abuse, and we're not just talking about, a small little act there that might be when your child's running across the road that you grab their arm. We're talking about physical abuse that causes non-accidental injuries like broken bones, for example. And I think it's not seen because it happens behind closed doors. It happens behind white picket fences. And children are often scared to talk about this because they only have their parents to look after them. And if they share that, then they might be removed from their family.
So they're high and alarming numbers. Why is it that those already disadvantaged also disproportionately experience trauma? Is that true? Is there a correlation there?
Yeah, I think it's, again, a challenging question and area for us to think about because we, of course, don't want to be discriminatory in the way that we think about
or make
this.
assumptions.
Yeah, I think absolutely child abuse happens across all sectors of our community. Absolutely happens in wealthy families as well as in families that are disadvantaged. However, it does happen more often in families where there's disadvantage. And sometimes that's due to disadvantage on disadvantage. So around food insecurity, housing insecurity, mental health difficulties that then make it difficult for people to hold down a job that then lead to housing insecurity. So you get a loading impact of disadvantage on each other, which leaves children really vulnerable. We know that there's a really strong correlation between poverty and mental health difficulties. And again, there's the mental health difficulties that some adults experience make it hard for them to parent in the way that works for the children.
So you've worked in this sector for a long time. If you look back on your career up to now, which service user has impacted you the most and why is that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do orientation with my staff every few months and I often talk with them about a particular teenager that I worked with about 15 years ago. And she talked with me about how she was being sexually abused by her stepfather in the family home where they were all living together. And one of the things that happened as a consequence of that is that she needed to move out and her family didn't believe her initially. And she subsequently had some really significant mental health problems and spent some time in an inpatient unit to help her with that. And many years later, she rang me, found me on Facebook or something, and she let me know that she was now studying youth work and that what she remembered about the work we did together was that I believed her when she shared with me about the sexual abuse she was experiencing when no one else did in her family, and that I came to visit her in the inpatient unit when none of her family visited her. And I share that story with the staff I work with to remind them about a couple of things. Firstly, we never know the impact that we'll have on people that we work with. And secondly, it's critical that we believe the people that we work with and that they know that we've got their back and that we will help walk the journey with them.
This is such a great example of the hard work and long-term efforts of organisations like Berry Street. People can't recover overnight. And the commitment of therapists, carers and specialists can take years to bear fruit. For example, did Allison have any idea of the impact she was having at the time?
No, I didn't. She was a challenging young woman to work with in lots of ways. It was difficult to go and visit her in the inpatient unit. It was an hour and a half away from my office. I was sometimes annoyed about needing to do that, and it was challenging. And so, no, I didn't realise. And sometimes when I'd go to see her, she wouldn't see me. And so it wasn't necessarily feeling cosy and warm at the time. But I had in my mind a particular approach, which was about believing her, about checking in if she was doing okay, and being a constant kind of support person to her. And it was only years later that I realised that made a difference for her.
Well, not only made a difference to her, she's gone on now to work in the same field. So for generations now, the work that you did will translate, and that's why you do it, huh?
It is why we do it.
So what are you hopeful about? What are some of the most sort of promising opportunities that you've seen for prevention, for addressing trauma in the future? What can be done and how can we support people to make sure this happens?
Yeah, so I'm excited about the fact we're having this conversation, that the word trauma is almost coming into our common vernacular now. It's in the everyday. People are understanding much more about trauma and its impact on our brains and our bodies and our emotions. That's a great thing. Mental health needs are getting a lot more focus than they have been over the last couple of decades. They need considerably more investment, but we're certainly turning a bit of a corner. We've been implementing a couple of evidence-based interventions with the kids that we work with. So one that's about trying to help the parents think more about their children and understand their children's internal worlds, particularly little ones, so under 5-year-olds. And we're seeing big difference there with parents being able to think more about why their little ones are doing the things that they're doing, which is helping them to be better parents. And we're also using another intervention, which has a very long name, which is called eye movement desensitization reprocessing, or EMDR. It's one of the most researched trauma interventions, and we've been using that with children in our program. And it again helps them to establish a safe place and to process their traumatic memories. Lots of the children we work with have post-traumatic stress disorder, and so they have nightmares, or they can't sleep, or they replay the negative things that have happened, and that gets in the way of them learning and playing with their friends. And so we help them to process those memories so that they don't interfere with their everyday and they can get a good night's sleep. And again, we're seeing really positive results with those interventions.
Okay, discussion around trauma and mental health is becoming more mainstream. Research, innovative and evidence-based interventions are proving successful. So really, the missing piece is community awareness, understanding how we can play a part and how important private and government funding is to stem the tide of children experiencing harm and trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that if we don't address it, the problems are much bigger in the future. We know that children that have experienced trauma go on, unfortunately, often to have lifelong mental health problems, which have a bigger impact on the community. Unfortunately, if children aren't helped with the problems that they've got, they can go on to join the criminal justice system as well, and that's a terrible outcome for all of us. So if we invest early in helping kids get the services they need, then we can prevent lifelong problems.
Amazing. Allison, thank you so much for your time today and for the incredibly important work that you do.
Thanks, Richelle.
Hi, I'm Bodhi Priti and I am a clinical team leader at Take Two.
Bodhi's been at Take Two for 12 years. She's a trained psychotherapist and family therapist specialising in kids from 0 to 5 years of age. A confronting statistic from the 2023 ACMS, which is the Australian Child Maltreatment Study, found those exposed to early trauma, such as abuse or family violence, were 3.6 times more likely to have a mental health or substance use disorder and were up to 7 times more likely to have both compared to those without trauma. So, how does Berry Street aim to mitigate for this and treat children who've been exposed to trauma early in their lives? What exactly are Bodhi and her team of clinicians tasked to do when helping children who are referred to Take Two?
Our role essentially is to, when we are referred a young person into our service, to have a really close look at what are the trauma experiences that they've had, and also to understand what are the challenges and the symptoms that they're presenting with now, and have a think about, are these a direct correlation from the trauma that they've had, or is there something else happening? So we really need to get an individualised picture of that child's challenges and what they've experienced. Like, for instance, you might have 3 siblings in a family that have been through significant family violence, and they're all at different ages and stages. And so even though they might share that same significant incident that happened, it'll all affect them differently. So we really need to understand that child's experience.
How do you go about gathering the information you need? Who are you talking to?
We actually speak to all the key people in the child's life. So the caregivers, if that's a parent or a grandparent or a foster carer. We speak to often child protection. They're involved in many of the children that we work with. We want to speak to the educators, so whether that's a childhood educator in a childcare centre or whether it's a teacher in school. What are they noticing about this child? What do they see are the challenges? And we do screeners for development. So that's where we're actually trying to get a sense of how far off their development is this child as a result of the trauma that they've experienced.
What kind of things do you see in your day-to-day role then?
So we have children referred from 0 to 18, so there's a really wide range. I might see a 2-year-old who is not really talking, not walking, who might be so distressed and upset and reactive that then when they get distressed they beat their head on the floor because they don't have an experience of what it means to actually go and get help from an adult because they're so used to not getting that help. And then at the other end of the spectrum we might get a teenager who's got really poor mental health and they're using substances, alcohol and drugs to numb and dull the pain that they're experiencing. They might be cutting themselves, disengaged from school and having very few relationships that they feel like they can trust. So, I mean, that's sort of a picture at two ends of the spectrum.
To be able to work with babies and toddlers right through to teens, that level of experience that you have, that's incredible. So how do you know which approaches work and which don't?
Well, I think with trauma, one of the things that we know works universally is that stability and safety are the cornerstones and the first things that we need to address when a child has had traumatic experiences. And so that looks like a safe home, a safe caregiver that is attuned to the child and responsive to the child's thoughts and feelings, and that they've got those routines, they're engaged in education. So with trauma, we really want to ensure that there's stability and there's that safety in place. And once we've got that and we have a sense that there's readiness for actually engaging in therapy, where we go to then and what we use at Take Two is child-parent psychotherapy from 0 to 5-year-olds. So that's instead of doing, say, individual therapy with a child, we look at having the caregiver in the room and we prepare the caregiver for the work that we're going to do so that they can be really present to the child when the three of us are together. And through that process of therapy, we're actually looking to help that child make sense of what they've experienced, to put words to the hard things that they've experienced, because that child who might be 3 comes into that room, they don't know that we know what happened to them. So there's a way, child-appropriate language, where we acknowledge these hard things happened to you and we think that this is how it affected you, and maybe you don't sleep so well now, and maybe you have a struggle to sit still when you're at school, and here's a place where we can talk about those hard things and we can help you with them.
Wow. Have you been working with individuals now that you've seen that process over a period of years?
Absolutely. One of the things I spoke about before, when we do that initial kind of look at a child's symptoms and what they're experiencing and what they've been through, we get sort of like a benchmark of their development. So I can think about a young person who was behind in 4 areas of their development. So you think about their gross motor skills, so they're walking and climbing, their fine motor skills, how they're using their hands and dexterity, their problem-solving skills, their social and emotional capacities, their communication, their ability to play. They were behind in 4 of the areas that we would expect them for their age. And in the process of doing that joint therapy with their carer over a 12-month period, by the end they were delayed in maybe 1 of those areas. So we can see that, particularly around speech and language, that if we can get in early and help that young person develop those skills, we're actually avoiding a lot of amplified challenges down the track.
In terms of individuals, is there another person maybe that you've worked with that you remember that sticks with you that maybe you can talk to us about? Of course, we know we have to be sensitive and not give away details, but I guess for us and for the general public, that idea that we need to really understand what people are experiencing and how your trauma-informed approaches are just so critical in helping people in this space.
Yeah, so a little girl who was 6 years old at the time when she came to us had experienced significant family violence. So really frightening, seeing, hearing and experiencing lots of yelling, adults experiencing substance issues, so alcohol and drug-affected adults, particularly if there's family violence. One of those parents is probably very preoccupied with survival and nobody's necessarily got oversight of the child and the child's experience at that point. So she was living with her auntie by the time that she came to us. So she was taken out of that situation because she was also sexually abused. And in the environment with her auntie, she was safe. There was that stability. There were the routines in place. She was getting enough food, enough sleep, all of those things that we look at. You know, is it a good time to actually help this child process that trauma? And so we entered into that joint therapy. And obviously for an adult coming into doing that work, it's really challenging to understand what this child has gone through. So there was work with the auntie to really prepare her to understand the kinds of things that might come up in the playroom, the kinds of themes that might get played out or things that might get acknowledged. And so once that's done, then bringing her into that therapy space and over a period of about 12 months, getting to play those themes out and also for her to hear a very child-appropriate story of what we understand about what happened to her and how her body might have been hurt along the way and how that's affected her now. So some of the things that she presented with at the beginning, she was having nightmares, couldn't go to sleep very well. Before bed at night, she would go around and check that all of the windows and all of the doors were locked before she could actually settle into sleep. She would wet herself at times during the day at school, and she had a lot of problems with social relationships. So a lot of children who've experienced trauma don't learn those basic fundamentals about how you give, how you take, how you cooperate and how you play with each other. And often they want to control play because they don't have a sense of safety, and so having a sense of control themselves is part of how they survive. So in the process of doing that work, you know, we're trying to restore that sense that there is a protective adult here who will take care of you, that you won't be returning. That's then and it's in the past, and this is now, and now is different. So there's lots of things that we're looking to achieve in that period of providing that therapy. And so at the end of that, we, again, do those kind of checks and balances about how her development is going. And at the end, there was quite a significant symptom reduction. So she was no longer having nightmares. She was no longer wetting herself at school. Social relationships take a bit longer, but some of those really what we call post-traumatic stress disorder type symptoms had really reduced.
Gosh, it's so confronting to think about, isn't it?
It is really. It's quite awful to think about the things that children go through.
So how has the approach to trauma services in the area that you work in, how has that changed in the years that you've been working in this area?
It's a good question, actually. So we still do individual therapy depending on the age of the child, but I would say our focus is really on how can we find the positive relationships, the safe adults in the child's world, and get them thinking more therapeutically about this child. How can we get them to help the child with the reality? Because they're with that child maybe 7 days a week, and also we work with teachers in the school to have them thinking about the child. So we have much more of what we call a systems approach, so all of the adults that are around the child, what we call a care team, we're really wanting them all thinking together about the child's challenges, not what's wrong with this child, but what's happened to this child, and to have that orientation about this child's been through a lot and it makes sense that they're behaving in the way that they're behaving.
And even for them to lead a little bit, like I found it interesting that you said to work out when is a good time to approach or to talk to the child about what they've experienced and what they've been through, not forcing them in any way.
Absolutely.
Too early. Is that something that you've seen change? Because that child may not be able to actually really comprehend or understand in any way what they've been through.
So it's really important that we go at a child's pace, and we don't want to keep children in therapy for long periods of time because that's not necessarily good for them either. Yeah, right. So sometimes we talk about episodes of therapy. They might come to us and then we finish a small piece of work and then they might come back later at different points of their development.
I ask most guests this next question, but particularly since Bodhi works with such young children, I can't help but be in awe of the work that she and her team do. So how does she look after herself so she can continue to do her incredibly important work?
Well, we don't do this work alone. That's the first important thing to think about when we're working with children with really quite complex trauma. So we have a real team approach that's very supportive, and we are really conscious of each other's mental health and very conscious of our own mental health. And when we need to provide more supervision, if things are getting really complicated. And we also, as a program at Take Two, we have access to a lot of specialist professionals when we get really tricky cases to help us with thinking about things. And when you have that team approach, you might be the one meeting with the child, but it's like there's quite a team behind you. So we have access to speech pathologists, occupational therapists, child and adolescent psychiatrists. We've got access to professionals that can provide an added lens on what this child might need.
So for the community, for all of us, what should we be alert to? What signs of trauma in children and in young people should all of us be looking out for?
I think if you know a child well, you would have a sense potentially that something seems a bit off. Something doesn't seem quite right. Maybe you've noticed things about them and seen that their sleep patterns have changed or their eating patterns have changed, or maybe they're a bit more withdrawn than usual or reactive. And when you're noticing those things, I think the first important thing is to provide a space to actually talk to them and listen. And that might be side by side is usually a really good way to approach that when you're doing a shared activity, and talk to them about, things seem a bit off at the moment. Is there anything happening? And leave lots of open-ended spaces in order for the child to have a go at trying to answer that question about what might be happening. They might be really struggling to even put words to what they're experiencing. And if your concerns are really quite significant and you think that there's a need for an external service, then we start thinking about what professionals you might consider reaching out to. So it might be a GP for a mental health care plan. You might be thinking about a mental health clinician to get involved. As an adult, you might go and sit with somebody and say, look, these are the things I'm noticing. What would you recommend?
Incredible. Bodhi, the work that you do is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing those stories and for spending some time with us today.
Thanks, Richelle. Pleasure.
These were quite confronting conversations. I know we lead really busy lives and we can be quite inward-looking, but there are children and families really suffering across our communities. It's a scourge that needs to end, and as a community we need to look up and ask what we can do to help. How can we support the great work of organisations like Berry Street, who are implementing cutting-edge programs that really make a difference? You've been listening to Stories from Berry Street, a podcast for Berry Street, produced by SoundCartel. Find out more about how you can support Berry Street at berrystreet.org.au. Listen out for more episodes on everything from healing childhood trauma, family violence, providing safe homes, and childhood neglect. Subscribe free wherever you listen to podcasts. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic, family, or sexual violence, please contact 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800 737 732. This podcast is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and Berry Street acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional custodians of the lands, skies and waterways across Australia.